We need to have a conversation in this country about why journalism matters. And we also need to be able to have hard conversations about tough issues like immigration. And those really need to be driven by fact-based reporting. So Sonia is a reporter who has risked her life to bring stories forward that otherwise would have gone unreported. She's also a Pulitzer Prize winner. So you really can't find a better voice, I feel, to sort of represent what journalists do. But by bringing the conversation into communities all over the state of California, I have learned a lot, actually, by being able to really be in contact and develop some collaborations with the students and the teachers who are responsible, really, for guiding these learners through their campus experience in a way that helps drive better citizenship.
You know, I think journalists have to do a better job at going out and reporting stories deeply and in a compelling way. I find a lot of what we cover is reported in a pretty boring way to begin with. I think that we need to bring more diverse voices to the media. I think a lot of people don't see themselves in the media, and I could argue that in terms of some stories that might be deemed more conservative. I mean, I remember being at the LA Times and seeing a story about families passing down hunting traditions and the use of guns. And I almost fell off my chair because you don't see those stories a lot in the news media. You don't see someone advocating why they think an abortion might be psychologically harmful to a woman in the news media. And I think we have to be better at not having blinders on. When I did my story, Enrique's Journey, I was telling the story of this boy going in search of his mother, and there's one point in the journey in Mexico where there are people who, because of their faith, help migrants, and they toss food to them on top of the trains, and it's this incredibly moving part of the story. And I wasn't particularly religious back then. I'm much more religious now, and I saw how readers responded to that. And when I went back and did the journey a second time to expand a newspaper series to a book, I told myself, Sonia, you need to take those blinders off and you need to focus on this one thing. And I purposely set out to look at the role that religion plays in sustaining these migrants as they're on top of these trains and fending off gangsters and bandits and corrupt cops, and the role that religion plays in the people that help them along the way. So I think we need to be mindful that maybe our worldview isn't the only worldview, and to try to go into stories, not only how you report stories, but the stories that we report. We are censoring in terms of what we choose to write about and what we choose not to write about. So I think that's important, and we need to have more diverse voices, both economic diversity, ethnic diversity, all kinds of diversity. I mean, most people in newsrooms are middle class on up right now, and so you don't see a lot of poor people working, relatively uneducated people who haven't gone to college in newsrooms. I think that's a problem. So I think we need to look for that.
The challenges in local journalism are not new. They've been around for quite a while. So we're experiencing the ongoing impact of the internet and digital advertising on the traditional business model. But I also feel like we've needed to improve and innovate on the product itself so that people understand the value and feel connected to it. I believe strongly in folks who live in this country and their desire to have fact-based information. Every community needs it. And in Shasta, where the impact of the fires in the last few years has been so acute, really that rebuilding process cannot happen successfully. There can't be accountability in it, and also representation of the resiliency of folks who live here in and around Redding. The story has to be told, and the folks who would tell it would be journalists. So you can maybe survive without a thing until you really need it. And in the case of American democracy, maybe we weren't paying enough attention to really what it takes to have a successful democracy. And one of those resources is those fact-based reporters in every community. So the polarization, the impact of propaganda, the changing dynamics of the business model all go back to one central question, which is what is the right way for citizens to really understand the world that they live in and their communities. So if we get that right, we will be honoring, I think, the framers of the Constitution, who were really ahead of their time in including freedom of the press in the very first amendment of our Constitution.
At the LA Times, you know, people didn't often even answer their phones from the public. There was an arrogance that I know what I'm doing, we're separate from you, and I think that was a mistake. I think that we need to draw those connections with the community so that, you know, we need to maintain that journalistic independence, but we need to also let the community in so that they feel like they're part of the process, they buy into the process, and they want to support what we do because it's helping them as well. So I think there are a lot of things that we can do to try to make that better.
I believe strongly that when folks talk about fake news, they talk about it in a lot of different ways. So the president uses it in one way, academics might use it in a different way. I prefer to approach it with in what ways do citizens and communities know that they can trust the news that's coming to them and how it's getting there. And the first thing that they can do is just find the journalists in their local communities, whether they are working in a television station, newsroom, or a radio station, or a newspaper, or a website, or a blog. Make sure you understand who's actually doing the hard work to cover your community. I would also encourage everybody to try to understand how social media works and how propaganda and lies can perpetuate themselves in a social media context in ways that are quite dangerous sometimes. So we all have that responsibility. You know, there's no safety belt, so to speak, in social media that keeps you safe even if something goes wrong. So we have to really develop those skills, and I feel like media literacy and civics education for students is also missing in this country. We've given up on teaching civics, and maybe we need to go back to doing that, because then the role of the citizen and the relationship to government and to news and to information, that needs to be taught. You're not born knowing those things. And I feel the Humanities Council in this initiative has been finding ways through storytelling, through direct engagement, and by asking communities, how does journalism impact your life? That's been a two-way street, and that has also been, I think, very rewarding, because then people know that they're in the conversation. We're not just talking at them.
So California Humanities is a nonprofit organization. We've been around for almost 44 years, and what we've done in that time is really develop programs and make grants to help us all understand each other better. What do we have in common? What are the stories and the histories and the cultures of California that we want to make sure that we're sharing with each other? And part of that work has been about finding out what young people care about. What are their stories? What are they thinking about? What's important to them as part of the future of California? And so journalism came up for us as one of those tools of civic engagement. Journalism is an important part of a democracy. Journalism done well is not only a skill for people to learn to do, but also to learn how to consume. And so having young people really at the heart of that intersection between production and consumption of current issues and topics felt like an important area for us to bring the humanities to bear on the stories of California. So we're very excited to be in Redding for a program that we have been doing for the past year as part of our California 2020 Youth Perspective and the Future of California initiative. The particular program that we're bringing to Shasta College, which is our primary partner, is called Democracy and the Informed Citizen. And it has been a year-long program where we've partnered with 3 other community colleges around the state to really lift up voices of young people, particularly in terms of how they are viewing journalism and how that's intersecting not only with their own stories, but with the stories of immigration throughout California.
After 2016, a lot of folks fell into a trap of only paying attention to national politics, which of course requires a lot of attention. But whatever side of the aisle you might see yourself on, we also have to pay equal amounts of attention to what's happening in our backyard. So newspapers have continued to suffer layoffs. They've continued to be challenged in terms of building a robust digital platform for reaching audiences in a local news context. We also have political campaign cycles that create millions of dollars for campaign ads that are not information-based resources for folks to make informed decisions. So the pressure is still there. That being said, there's a number of really great nonprofits have started up. A lot of newsrooms have tried to innovate fast. So people are really fighting the good fight. But I think the pressure that a community can feel, especially when a disaster hits, like with the fires in this part of the state, we need to do better and we need to do more right away, because the rebuilding process is real and it's going to take years. And I feel like if you zoomed out, this country has to do some rebuilding at a national level in terms of that trust in the media. But we've always been a very, very democratic country. We believe in local control. Think about schools, for example. So if you don't do it in your backyard, it's not going to matter what's happening somewhere else.
For a functioning democracy, you need informed citizens. You don't need propaganda, either from Democrats or Republicans, conservatives or liberals. You don't want to make decisions based on propaganda. If you look at the immigration issue, you can objectively look at why a wall is a bad idea. Spending $18 to $80 billion on a wall is a bad idea. I have written about immigration for 30 years. I can tell you what will solve this issue. You need to, we've tried deterrence, make it so nasty for people when they arrive here that they won't want to come. And it simply has not worked. We have taken, I reported on a mother last summer when they were separating families at the border, and they took away her 5-month-old baby and 3 other children, and for months the government and she had no idea where that 5-month-old baby was. They didn't even view that woman as humane enough to track where her child went. When they finally gave her back, because of a court order ordering the reunification of these families, they gave her back, they were supposed to give her back her 4 kids, they gave her the wrong baby. And when they finally gave her her 4 correct children, they released her at a bus station at midnight with 0 money at midnight in Texas. We have been just revoltingly inhumane, and it hasn't worked. And the reason is that, I'm just back from a month in Honduras where, I left by the skin of my teeth in one piece. I had someone murdered a block away from me one night out on the street. When that plane took off from Honduras, I gave a sigh of relief that I was alive and in one piece. These are some of the most violent countries in the world: Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador. You have to deal with what is pushing people out of these places. And what's pushing them out is extraordinary levels of violence, an incredible grip of control by the gangs in these neighborhoods, a very weak government, a very corrupt government. When you have institutions, the health department, the infrastructure department, where 1/3 of the funding goes to corruption. Some people say that at least $1 in $4 in Honduras, public dollars, goes to corruption. You have extortion, and people are told, you either hand over your business or your house or we kill you in 24 hours. Girls who are told, they have this term in Honduras, enamorado de ojo. A gang leader fell in love with you instantly just by seeing you, and they demand that you be their girlfriend, and if you say no, they murder you. This is what's driving people out, and I've reported on U.S. funded programs that have been incredibly effective in the worst neighborhoods at reducing violence. These are the programs that President Trump wants to cut, and has already cut 20% and wants to decimate. We need to fund more of that, I would argue, and that will slow the flow of people coming here. And I think that in the meantime, we need to be compassionate towards the relatively small number of people who are now arriving at our border. Before, people who knocked on our door were mostly economic migrants. They came looking for a better life. But now they're mostly refugees. That's someone who's running for their life, and they don't have a government that can or will protect them. And we're getting 1/4 of the number of migrants at our border that we were getting in 2000. It's a fraction of the flow. And I would argue that we should treat those people with compassion. Let them go to immigration court, give them a real fair process in that court. And this is the part liberals don't like: if you don't win your asylum claim, then I don't have a problem with being tough on the back end and going out and deporting that person. ICE has the ability to deport only 4% of those here illegally every year. And the president's approach is to just make everyone feel enormous terror. And I would say instead, be more compassionate on the front end, but be tougher on the back end, and deport people who do not qualify for asylum in our court system.
I think because immigration is such a complicated and heated issue, we can end up with a lot of attempts to try to solve problems or take approaches to some of the aspects of the challenge of immigration, which ranges from public health interests and concerns to education to the impact in economies, both positive and what some see as negative impacts of immigration. There's a lot of folks trying to do a lot of things to solve parts of this problem. And it doesn't feel very balanced at the national level, of course. We have a huge fight that's ongoing in terms of what the president sees as his priorities and what the Congress is maybe able or willing to do. So we don't have a lot of coherence in terms of public policy. Some communities have sanctuary laws, others have passed resolutions saying they will not be sanctuary laws. I think understanding and talking about it in a way that's honest, that reflects what the law requires and what it doesn't require, is really important for folks to understand. So if this county has a vote and it's democratically executed and there's open civil debate about it, then that's what the will of the people has spoken to. Even in a close vote, you have to live with that vote. But I do feel like the more debate, the more engagement around the facts, and the more storytelling to humanize the issues and the challenges, that's really critical, because we do better by humanizing and understanding the impacts on our lives and the lives of our neighbors in these discussions, and not creating abstractions in terms of who's involved and what choices we're making that impact their lives also.
Well, I would say that people in newsrooms have never been good business people, and some geniuses decided 15 years ago, 20 years ago, to give away their product for free on the internet, which, we're sitting at a college now. If they gave away their product for free, they wouldn't last long, and that's been kind of the upshot of that. The ads on the internet pay 1/10 of what they pay in print, and so the result has been a lot less revenue when Google and Facebook basically take what newspapers produce and put it out there for free for people to see. That's created a crisis in journalism in terms of revenue. At the Los Angeles Times, where I used to work, I now work for the New York Times. We went from 1,400 people in the newsroom to 400. That means a lot less bodies to go out there and spend months doing the really difficult stuff, the really challenging stories, the big stories that I like to do, where you take on a topic like immigration and try to tell a story in a really compelling way, not a boring way, but a way that will grab your reader by the throat in a narrative and say, you must read this, and you will be spellbound by this, and you will want to read it like you want to read a good book. That takes a lot of resources, and when you cut the revenue sources in that way by half or more, this is what you get. You get very little resources and people being asked to produce too often widgets and spit out a certain number of stories a day. That's a problem. We need communities to support good journalism, good local journalism, and good national journalism like the LA Times and the New York Times that still have reporters that go out and try to do the tough work. I'm the child of immigrants, so I think I've focused on migration and refugees because I come from a family that has spent a century fleeing persecution. My mother was 7 in Poland when she fled right before World War II, and her family members who decided to stay in Poland were massacred, were gassed in Auschwitz. My father's family left Syria in the 1920s fleeing Christian persecution. Both of them went to Argentina and Latin America. As the military gained control of the universities, my father was a professor. They decided in 1960 to come to the United States, and I was born in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm the only one in my family born in the United States. I think my experiences around journalism were really shaped by the fact that when I was 13 years old, my dad died suddenly, and my mother decided to take us back to live in Argentina. Like many immigrants, while she appreciates the United States, she longed for her home country and all the things that she had grown up with. But it was a very bad time to return to that country. It was the beginning of the so-called Dirty War, and the military was just taking power, and over the coming few years, they would disappear, that means murder, 30,000 people. So one of my best friends was disappeared and tortured to death. One of my family members was tortured. And one day I was walking down the streets of Buenos Aires and I saw a pool of blood on the sidewalk, and I asked my mother what had happened, and she said the military killed 2 journalists. And I asked her why, and she said, well, those journalists were trying to explain the truth about what's going on here. And I think in that moment, I mean, I was 14 years old, but I very clearly sensed what happens when the people who are in power do not want an alternative point of view, want one narrative only, and want to eliminate anyone who presents a different narrative, and the need to hold people in power accountable. And I decided in that moment, I was 14 years old, to become a journalist. I fear, in terms of what's happening in this country, in the attempts to silence any dissent, only have one narrative of what is possible, to call journalists the enemy of the people. That is what the Nazis called the Jews. I think that's very dangerous territory, and so I think it's critical to have a strong media that challenges people in power. If you look at the investigative journalists and things that they have, if you look at the Pulitzer Prizes and what's won for investigative reporting or narrative reporting, that's journalists holding people in power accountable. And I fear, there was a news story today that 1,300 local communities have lost any kind of local news source. That's complete freedom for corrupt political officials to do whatever they want. So I would think that the American public would want a strong media that would hold people in power accountable.